The survey crew entered the grove at first light, when the ash still held the shape of footprints from the day before. 6 men with clipboards and paint cans, moving between columns of charred redwood. The protocol was straightforward. Check the bark, check the base. Mark anything that wouldn't recover. Red paint on a blackened trunk meant dead timber, scheduled for assessment, possible removal. They moved efficiently, working in pairs through the interior, calling out to each other across the distance between trunks. The grove was quiet in the way burned groves are quiet, the background noise of insects and wind through live canopy, replaced by the soft percussion of loose bark shifting and the creak of standing dead wood. By mid-morning, 17 trunks had been marked. Then one of the surveyors crouched at the base of a hollow trunk, paint can in hand, and stopped. Growing from the interior of a tree that should have been dead was something green. The question the survey wasn't designed to answer is this: when you mark a tree dead, what exactly are you marking? A timber survey has a specific logic. It is not a biological assessment. It is a volume calculation, an accounting of what stands, what has fallen, what can be removed, and what the land will yield once the damaged material is cleared. The men who enter a burned grove with clipboards and paint cans are not ecologists. They are trained to read bark condition, structural integrity, crown loss, and cambium response. They apply a protocol that has worked reliably for decades across hundreds of surveyed sites. Dead means dead. The paint goes on. The protocol exists precisely because ambiguity is expensive. In time, in board feet, in the administrative cost of revisiting assessments that should have been final. A survey that second-guesses its own classifications is a survey that cannot be used as the basis for a removal plan. The protocol's clarity is its function. What makes the notes from this particular survey unusual is not the number of trunks marked. Fires of this severity routinely produce mortality rates that justify large-scale removal assessments. What makes the notes unusual is a detail recorded in the margin of the third field sheet, added in different ink than the surrounding entries, as though written after the crew had returned to the staging area and the surveyor had sat with what he had seen long enough to decide it needed documenting. The note says, "Cambium green on marked specimens, multiple locations." Below it, shoots present, hollow interior, trunk 7 and trunk 12. Below that, nothing. No follow-up entry, no revised mortality classification. The paint was already dry. Coast redwoods are among the most fire-adapted organisms on the continent. This is not a marginal claim. It is documented in National Park Service material on coast redwood ecology, and confirmed across decades of post-fire observation in the groves of Humboldt, Del Norte and Marin counties. The bark of a mature Sequoia sempervirens can reach 12 inches in thickness on older specimens, and contains almost no resin, the flammable compound that makes other conifers so vulnerable to crown fire. Tannins in the bark act as a natural fire retardant. The tree evolved in a landscape where fire was not an exception, but a recurring condition, and its biology reflects that history at every structural level. Fire is, in the strict evolutionary sense, part of what the redwood is designed to survive, not an interruption to its life cycle, but a pressure that shaped the life cycle itself, across millions of years of recurring burn events in the California coastal range. The cambium layer is the critical tissue. It sits between the outer bark and the wood, a thin sheet of actively dividing cells responsible for the tree's diameter growth and its continued transport of water and nutrients from root to crown. When a fire passes through a grove, the outer bark chars and dies. What the survey protocol checks is whether the fire's heat penetrated far enough inward to kill the cambium. Brown cambium means the vascular system is compromised and the tree will not recover. Green cambium means the pipeline is intact. The tree is moving water, the tree is alive. 17 trunks had been marked before the surveyor found green cambium under the char on trunk 7. He checked it twice. He checked the adjacent area. He moved to trunk 8 and applied the paint and then went back to 7, and looked again at what the scraping had revealed. A thin line of living tissue in a trunk his own notation already classified as dead. The biology of what he found goes deeper than cambium condition. This is where the coast redwood stops behaving like other trees and starts behaving like something the survey protocol was not equipped to evaluate. The feature that makes redwood fire recovery so difficult to classify using standard timber survey methods is the burl. A redwood burl is a rounded, irregular growth that forms on the trunk, at the root collar, or along exposed root systems. Burls are not damage responses in the ordinary sense. National Park Service documentation on coast redwood biology describes burl tissue as containing dormant buds capable of producing entirely new trees when the parent tree is damaged or killed. This is not metaphor. A burl removed from a dead or dying redwood and placed in moist soil will produce shoots. The burl carries the tree's growth instructions in a form that does not require the standing trunk to remain alive. The implication for a timber survey is not subtle. When a surveyor marks a trunk dead and moves on, the question of what happens to the burl tissue at that trunk's base has not been answered. The trunk may be dead. The burl may not be. These are not the same assessment. Standard mortality classification does not distinguish between them. The surveyor's note about shoots present on trunks 7 and 12 was describing exactly this. The hollow interior detail is significant. A trunk burned through from the inside by smouldering combustion that can continue for days after a surface fire passes will read as dead by every visible exterior indicator. The bark is gone or charred to mineral ash. The wood inside is consumed. There is no crown. But at the base of that hollow column, protected by soil and by the insulating mass of the root system below, burl tissue can survive temperatures that kill everything above ground. When the temperature drops and light reaches the forest floor through the newly opened canopy, that tissue activates. Shoots emerge from inside the hollow trunk, growing upward toward the gap the fire created. The dead tree becomes the scaffold for the living system underneath it. This is documented behavior. Post-fire surveys at Prairie Creek Redwood State Park and recovery documentation, following the 2020 CZU Lightning Complex fire, which burned through portions of Big Basin Redwood State Park with an intensity that led initial assessments to describe the grove as functionally destroyed. Found burl sprouting across burn areas within weeks. The grove was not destroyed, it was responding. What the surveyor found in the hollow trunks fits this pattern exactly. The biology explains the green cambium. It explains the shoots in the hollow interior. It explains why 17 marked trunks might include specimens that were not, by any precise biological definition, dead. What the biology does not explain is the geometry, and the geometry is where the survey notes become harder to set down. If each of the marked trunks were an independent tree independently recovering from fire damage, the pattern of sprouting would be variable. Different burl positions, different shoot heights, different timing, different orientation relative to the canopy gap above. Recovery across independent organisms is not synchronized. It is distributed, irregular, shaped by each individual tree's specific damage profile and its specific reserve of stored energy. No two trunks would be expected to express the same recovery pattern at the same moment. The surveyor's notes describe something different. In the section of the grove the field sheets designate as the interior cluster, 11 trunks within approximately a 40-foot radius. Several marked specimens showed growth patterns consistent with each other in ways that independent recovery does not produce. Shoots emerging not randomly from whatever burl tissue happened to survive, but from similar positions, interior base, oriented toward the same directional gap in the canopy overhead. On trunks 7, 12, and a third specimen designated only as trunk 9, shoot clusters appeared at heights between 18 and 24 inches from the ground, emerging from the northeast-facing interior wall of each hollow. 3 separate trunks, similar heights, similar orientation, similar timing, all 3 observed on the same survey day. The surveyor recorded this without interpretation. The note is descriptive, not analytical, but the description raises a question timber survey protocol has no category for. Were these 3 trunks recovering independently, or were they expressing a shared signal from something below them? The answer requires understanding what a redwood root system actually is. Individual coast redwoods do not have deep taproots. Their root systems are shallow, typically 3 to 6 feet deep, but they spread laterally across extraordinary distances and they graft. When 2 root systems from neighbouring trees make contact, they fuse. Nutrients, water and signalling compounds move through the grafted connection between what appear, above ground, to be entirely separate trees. National Park Service documentation on coast redwood ecology describes root fusion as a stabilizing mechanism. Trees in a grove share structural load through their interconnected root systems, which is part of why old-growth redwoods survive wind events that would topple isolated trees of equivalent height. But the grafted root network is not only structural, it is also chemical. What moves through those connections includes the stress compounds and hormonal signals that trigger burl activation and shoot production. This means a fire event affecting the above-ground portion of one tree in a grafted network sends a signal through the root system that connected trees detect and respond to. The response, burl activation, cambium protection, shoot production, does not have to originate independently in each trunk. It can originate in the network and express simultaneously across multiple connected points. 3 trunks, same height, same orientation, same day. Not coincidence, coordination. The distinction matters more than it might appear. Independent recovery is a biological story about individual organisms responding to damage with the resources they individually possess. Coordinated recovery is a different story, one in which the unit of response is not the trunk but the network, and in which what looks like 17 separate trees behaving in parallel is actually one system expressing the same instruction through 17 separate points. The survey was designed to evaluate the first kind of story. It encountered the second kind. The fairy ring formation makes more sense in this context. A fairy ring in a redwood grove is a circle of younger trees growing around the perimeter of an ancient stump. A tree that fell or was cut sometimes centuries ago, whose root system survived and continued producing new growth from burl tissue at the stump's base and along the lateral roots extending outward. The ring is not a coincidence of separate seedlings. It is a single organism expressing itself through multiple trunks, each of which will eventually appear, to anyone surveying above ground, to be an independent tree. Fairy rings have been documented extensively in the old-growth groves of Humboldt Redwood State Park, and in research on redwood regeneration following 19th century logging and fire events in Marin County. They are not rare. They are a standard feature of redwood grove ecology. What the Surveyor's interior cluster may have been is a fairy ring in an early and fire-triggered stage of expression. The ancient root system beneath that 40-foot radius, surviving underground while the above-ground trunks burned, activating simultaneously across multiple connected burl sites, producing shoots that emerge from similar positions in similar orientations because they were responding to the same signal from the same network below. The survey saw 11 trunks. The grove may have contained one organism. In the weeks following the initial survey, a researcher from a state forestry agency visited the site as part of a follow-up assessment and took core samples from 3 burl formations at the base of marked trunks in the interior cluster. Core sampling of burl tissue is not a standard survey procedure. The samples were taken informally, at the researcher's own initiative, and documented in a separate report filed with the state office, not incorporated into the original survey record. The 2 documents have existed in separate filing systems since the assessment was completed. As far as the available record shows, they have never been read together by anyone with the authority to revise the mortality classifications the paint marks established. 2 of the 3 burl cores produced age estimates consistent with the standing trees above them, roughly comparable, suggesting the burl tissue formed as those particular trunks grew. This was the expected result. It is what normal burl formation looks like in the core record, tissue that accumulated alongside the trunk, neither substantially older nor younger, a companion feature rather than an ancestor. The third sample, taken from a large irregular burl formation at the root collar of trunk 9, returned an estimate substantially older than the trunk above it. The researcher noted the margin of uncertainty carefully. But even at the lower bound of that estimate, the burl tissue predated the standing trunk by a margin that cannot be explained by normal burl formation during the tree's growth. The burl was not part of that trunk's history. The trunk was part of the burls. A burl older than the trunk above it means the trunk was not the beginning of anything. It was a recent expression of something that had been expressing itself in this location across multiple generations of trunk death and regrowth, each trunk rising from the same burl formation, living its centuries falling or burning and being replaced by the next expression from the same tissue below. The burl survives. The trunks are temporary. What looks like a tree is one season in a story the underground system has been telling since before any record of this grove exists. The survey saw trunk 9. It marked it dead. The paint dried. The burl beneath it was older than the survey's oldest institutional predecessor, and it was already producing the shoots that the surveyor found strange enough to note in different ink after the rest of the day's entries were complete. The tree wasn't recovering. Something beneath the tree was. How old is a redwood grove? The question sounds simple. The answer depends entirely on what you are measuring, and on whether the thing you are measuring has ever been measured before. The standing trees can be aged with reasonable precision. Core samples, ring counts, dendrochronology. The methods are established, and the results are reliable within accepted margins. A trunk 200 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter is typically somewhere between 500 and 1200 years old, depending on site conditions and growth rate. That range is wide, but it has a floor and a ceiling. It describes something bounded, something countable. The burl is not bounded in the same way, and the root system beneath it even less so. The earliest systematic surveys of California's old-growth redwood groves were conducted in the 1850s and 1860s by the General Land Office as part of the federal effort that mapped the Western Territories for settlement and resource extraction. Those surveys recorded timber volume, stand density, and approximate species composition. They were not biological inventories. They were resource assessments. What the surveyors measured was what could be converted to board feet. What they did not measure, what their instruments and their mandate gave them no mechanism to measure, was the lateral extent of the underground systems the standing trees were connected to, or the age of the burl formations at the trees' bases, or whether a grove of apparently separate trunks was, in any biologically meaningful sense, one organism or many. This is not a cover-up. It is a limitation of measurement. The people who conducted those surveys were not incurious or negligent. They were working within a mandate that defined what mattered, and the underground system did not matter to that mandate. You cannot record what your instruments cannot detect, and your instruments are shaped by what your mandate requires you to find. And it has persisted through every subsequent survey of these groves because the protocol has never been updated to capture what it was not originally designed to see. The General Land Office surveys of the 1860s recorded what was above ground. The timber surveys of the 20th century recorded what was above ground. The post-fire assessment that produced the field notes we have been examining recorded what was above ground. The underground clone extent, the lateral reach of the grafted root network, the age of the burl formations anchoring it, the identity question of whether this cluster is 10 trees or 1, has never been formally measured. Measuring it was never the job. The consequence is not abstract. It has a documented material expression in the history of grove management across Northern California, and that history is uncomfortable to read carefully. In the decades following the initial timber surveys of the 1850s and 1860s, logging operations cleared significant portions of the old-growth coast redwood range. Some groves were left intact because access was difficult, or because the timber companies turned their attention elsewhere. Others were cut in sections, some trunks removed, others left standing, the cut stumps assessed as dead timber, the land reclassified. In several documented cases, follow-up surveys conducted years and sometimes decades later found vigorous regrowth on sites where the cut had been assessed as complete. New trunks emerging from root collars and burl formations on stumps the original surveys had categorized as removed, no longer economically relevant, not worth tracking. The Cathedral Trees area in Prairie Creek Redwood State Park contains documented examples of exactly this pattern. Ancient stumps from 19th century logging operations surrounded by fairy ring regrowth, the new trunks now large enough to meet old growth standards by height and diameter, growing from root systems that were never cut because the saws could not reach underground. The stumps remain at the center of the rings as evidence of what was taken. The root system below them is evidence of what the survey never measured and the clear cut never actually reached. Two kinds of record, occupying the same ground, telling different parts of the same story. What was removed in those operations was one expression of something that continued beneath the ground. The organism was not destroyed, the trunk was, and the survey that authorized the clearing recorded a death that was, from the underground network's perspective, incomplete. Consider the arithmetic. A burl formation in the Cathedral Trees area connected to stumps from logging operations conducted in the 1880s has been producing new trunks for at least 140 years since those stumps were cut. If the burl tissue was already mature at the time of the cut, already old enough to anchor a trunk large enough to be worth logging, then the formation predates the 1880s by centuries. If the age estimate from the trunk 9 core sample in the surveyed grove is taken at its lower bound, and if that formation is part of the same lateral root network connecting the interior cluster trunks, then the underground system in this grove may have been continuous since before the General Land Office arrived in California to record it for the first time. The first survey of this grove produced no record of the underground system because it was not looking for one. Every subsequent survey produced no record of it for the same reason. The post-fire assessment added a margin note in different ink and filed it in a system that does not communicate with the follow-up report containing the core sample data. Each document is accurate. Each document is incomplete. Together they describe something neither one can contain. Not one failure of record keeping, a sequence of them, each individually explainable, each a product of instruments and mandates that were never designed for the question the grove was posing. Together they form something harder to dismiss than any single gap. The survey saw the trunks. The trunks were the least permanent thing in the grove, and the thing that will outlast both the trunks and the surveys, the root system, the burl tissue, the lateral network grafted through a 40-foot radius of soil, has no formal record in any archive of ever having been measured, each survey seeing one tree, none of them mapping what was underneath. The gap between those two sentences is where the grove actually lives. Picture the surveyor standing at trunk 9 on the morning the follow-up assessment was completed. He has his field notes from the original survey. He has the red paint mark he applied himself, dried now, still legible on the charred exterior bark. He has the researcher's core sample report, which he has read and not yet decided what to do with. His protocol gives him a form with fields for mortality classification, volume estimate, and removal recommendation. He is a careful man. He has followed every step the protocol requires, applied the criteria correctly, and produced a record that any auditor would find complete. The form reflects that care accurately. The form does not have a field for what he found. What he could write, what the margin note in different ink was reaching toward, was this. The dead trees were not dead. The category had been applied correctly, by the protocol's own definition, to trunks that met every visible criterion for mortality classification. And the category was wrong. Not because the protocol was misapplied, because the protocol was measuring the wrong thing. Here is what the record shows. The fire occurred in the late season of its documented year. The survey crew entered within weeks of containment. 17 trunks marked in the interior cluster. Margin note added after the crew returned to staging, cambium green, shoots present, trunks 7 and 12. Follow-up core samples taken weeks later by a state forestry researcher, operating outside the formal survey mandate, on his own initiative. Age estimate for trunk 9's burl formation returned substantially older than the trunk above it. Core sample report filed in a separate state office folder. Original survey record never updated. The two documents never read together. The paint marks on the interior cluster trunks remain, as far as the available record shows, the official mortality classification. Fire date, survey date, paint marks, green shoots, synchronized emergence across 3 trunks on the same morning. Burl age predating the standing tree. Follow-up report filed separately. Original record never revised. 2 archives that have not spoken to each other since the assessment was completed. Each step documented. Each step the product of instruments and mandates that were never designed to see the same thing. Together they describe a grove that the surveys have been visiting for a century and a half, without ever measuring the part of it that will survive them all. The root system was here before the General Land Office arrived in California. It was here when the first timber surveys walked through these groves with their volume estimates and their board-foot calculations. It was here when the logging operations of the 1880s cut the trunks that the cathedral tree's fairy rings are still growing around today. It was here when the fire moved through this grove and the survey crew followed it with their paint cans, and it was expressing itself through 17 hollow trunks before the first field sheet was complete. It will be here when the survey records have been archived past the point where anyone retrieves them. The burl does not require the trunk above it to remain continuous. It carries the grove's growth instructions in tissue that has survived every fire cycle this forest has experienced since before any record of it exists. What the trunk 9 core sample suggested, carefully within stated margins of uncertainty, in a report that has never been incorporated into the survey it should be read alongside, is that the formation at that root collar has been doing this for longer than the standing tree above it, longer than the grove's recorded history, longer than the surveys that have been counting its expressions as individual trees since the 1860s. The surveyor standing at trunk 9 with his paint-stained hands and his form with no box for what he found was not the first person to look at this grove and see less than it contained. He was the latest in a sequence of observers whose instruments were accurate and whose records were incomplete. each one documenting the above-ground expression and leaving the underground system without an entry in any formal archive. The sequence began with the General Land Office and continued through every assessment that followed. Each observer did the job they were sent to do. None of them were sent to do the job the grove required. The field notes are still in the record. The core sample report is still in the state forestry files, in a separate folder from the survey it was never incorporated into. The grove is still growing in the way groves like this one grow, from the bottom, from the ancient tissue outward, through the root collars and the burl formations and the hollow trunks that surveyors have been walking past for 160 years without measuring what connects them. And somewhere in the interior cluster, at the base of a trunk that may or may not still be standing with its red paint mark fading on charred bark, there is a burl formation that was old when the surveyor crouched beside it. It was producing shoots before he arrived. It will produce them after the last copy of his field notes has been archived past retrieval. The question the survey raised and could not answer is still the right question. Were the shoots emerging from those hollow trunks the visible signs of fire-adapted trees doing exactly what redwood biology has always done? Recovering, resprouting, reclaiming the canopy gap with the tools 4 million years of evolution provided? Or were they something older than recovery? The surface signal of an underground system so continuous and so laterally extensive that the individual trunks above it are not the trees at all, but only the most recent way the grove has chosen to show itself to anyone standing above ground, looking up, counting what they can see. The grove does not answer, it grows. That is what the record cannot fully contain. Not a mystery, not a failure, not a gap waiting to be filled by a better survey, but a simple, ongoing biological fact that predates every instrument brought to measure it, and will continue after every instrument has been retired. The shoots emerging from the hollow trunks were the grove doing what it has always done. The survey's inability to classify them correctly was the survey doing what it was always designed to do. Both things are true. They describe each other's limits exactly. The grove does not answer, it grows.